To be captured by a Native American tribe during the frontier wars often meant a one-way ticket to unimaginable suffering. The narratives of most prisoners ended in the grim silence of slavery or a torturous death. But what if I told you that a handful, staring directly into the abyss, not only survived but clawed their way back to freedom through sheer will and impossible circumstances? Prepare to hear of escapes so audacious, they'll make your heart pound. Simon Kenton, born in Virginia, departed his home at the age of 16 under the belief that he had killed another in a brawl. This event propelled him toward the frontier and into military service. He joined the militia, where his skills were utilized as a scout during Lord Dunmore's war against the Shawnee. It was in this period he formed an acquaintance with Simon Girty, then an interpreter, a man who would later be deemed a renegade. They pledged a lifelong friendship. The conclusion of this conflict was shortly followed by the eruption of the American Revolution, a larger war that placed Kenton and Girty on opposing sides. Girty aligned with the British, while Kenton committed to the American cause. Kenton actively fought in the Revolution and continued his service even after the British surrender. The Shawnee, a tribe against whom Kenton had gained considerable experience, had allied with the British. The victorious Americans sought retribution against them, and Kenton was assigned intelligence-gathering duties. In September of 1778, Kenton, accompanied by 2 companions, undertook a reconnaissance mission across the Ohio River into Shawnee territory. Their objective was to gather information on Shawnee movements and strength. During this mission, they located a Shawnee camp that included a substantial herd of good quality horses. They made the decision to appropriate some of these animals. Moving with stealth, they managed to untether approximately a dozen horses before a Shawnee individual discovered their presence. Alerted, Kenton and his companions mounted the stolen horses and galloped towards the Ohio River, hoping to make their escape. They established a marginal lead over their Shawnee pursuers, but their flight was complicated by the sudden onset of a severe storm. The deluge swelled the Ohio River, transforming it into a violent, fast-flowing torrent. The horses, spooked by the turbulent water, refused to enter. Kenton and his men understood that finding a safer crossing further upstream was necessary, but with Shawnee warriors closing in, this presented a significant risk. Kenton instructed his companions to remain with the horses while he ascended a nearby hill to assess how much time they had before the Shawnee arrived. Upon reaching the crest of the hill, Kenton observed 5 Shawnee warriors on horseback, positioned only a few hundred feet away. He raised his long rifle, aimed at the nearest warrior, and squeezed the trigger. The flint struck steel, but no ignition followed. The powder in the pan of his flintlock had become damp from the storm, rendering the weapon useless. His exposed position made him an easy target for the Shawnee to spot. Kenton turned and ran, exerting his maximum effort, but a man on foot could not outpace mounted warriors. 2 riders moved to intercept his path, while another Shawnee closed from behind and tackled him to the ground. As the Shawnee warriors began to bind Kenton, one of his companions, hearing the commotion, moved towards the sound to offer assistance. He advanced, but then disappeared from Kenton's line of sight. A minute passed, punctuated by the sharp report of a gunshot. Shortly thereafter, the Shawnee returned, carrying the freshly taken scalp of Kenton's compatriot. The fate of the 3rd companion at this point is not explicitly detailed in this immediate encounter, but the Shawnee now had Kenton as their prisoner. The Shawnee held a particular enmity for Kenton, both for the act of horse theft and for his service to the American military forces. Over the subsequent days, as the Shawnee party transported him towards their principal village for more formalized torture, they subjected him to beatings during the daylight hours. At night, his captors bound him so tightly that his limbs were stretched to the point of near dislocation. When seeking diversion, they would tie him to an unbroken horse and send it bolting through dense underbrush, causing his skin to be torn by thorns and branches. After 3 days of this treatment, Kenton, his body covered in lacerations and contusions, arrived at a Shawnee encampment. Here, he was introduced to a customary form of ordeal known as running the gauntlet. The Shawnee warriors and villagers would form two parallel lines, creating a narrow lane through which the prisoner was compelled to run. The objective for the prisoner was to make it from one end to the other without falling. The challenge lay in the fact that everyone lining the path would attempt to strike, trip, or otherwise impede the runner. Kenton was stripped of his clothing and forced to run the gauntlet numerous times. Each attempt ended with the Shawnee warriors beating him to the ground, accompanied by their derisive laughter. Through these experiences, Kenton came to the stark realization that his life was being preserved for a specific purpose. The Shawnee intended to burn him publicly at their main village, Makachek. Despite the severe physical abuse he endured, Kenton's spirit remained unbroken, and he became resolved to escape. Several weeks into his captivity, another gauntlet was organized. As Kenton ran down the lane between the jeering lines of Shawnee, he saw an opportunity. He abruptly changed direction, feinted, and then lunged, breaking through the line of his captors. The Shawnee were momentarily stunned by his audacity. Kenton ran with all his speed, outpacing any of the Shawnee on foot. He managed to reach the cover of nearby woods before his captors could effectively raise an alarm and organize a pursuit. However, his flight led him directly into the path of another group of Shawnee this party mounted, who were en route to the village. They gave chase and swiftly overtook him. One warrior struck Kenton on the head with a tomahawk, felling him. Kenton, however, survived this blow and his recapture. The Shawnee were determined not to grant him another opportunity for escape. His treatment intensified. Each day he was suspended in the center of the camp, exposed for all to see and abuse. Women from the tribe would approach to strike him with clubs or switches, while children would spit on him. Eventually, the party reached Makachek. Kenton, observing the layout of the village, situated where rivers meandered through green valleys, found a grim acceptance of his fate, noting it as a seemingly pleasant place to die. According to Shawnee custom, a prisoner was typically warned of his execution only a few hours in advance. Kenton received this notification. His face was painted black, a traditional preparation for death by fire, signifying that his execution was scheduled for the following morning. Yet, fate had not concluded its dealings with Simon Kenton. Mere hours before he was to be led to the stake, Kenton was taken to the council house. A meeting was underway between the Shawnee leadership and some of their white British allies. Kenton paid little attention to the proceedings until, amongst the unfamiliar faces, he recognized Simon Gertie, his old friend from his early days as a scout. Kenton's appearance, marked by the black paint and the multitude of injuries he had sustained, made him unrecognizable to Gertie. Gertie, maintaining his loyalty to the British Crown, was a welcome figure among the Shawnee during his own scouting and diplomatic missions. Upon noticing a white American prisoner evidently severely beaten, Gertie requested an interview, likely hoping to glean intelligence useful to his superiors. Even as Gertie questioned Kenton, he did not recognize the man before him. Kenton, fearing retribution from the Shawnee if he spoke out of turn or revealed too much, was initially too afraid to disclose his identity. It was only when Gertie directly asked for his name that Kenton, overcome, stated it, reportedly with tears. Gertie's reaction was immediate. He rose and embraced his battered friend. Their earlier pledge of lifelong friendship, made years before under different circumstances, was a bond Gertie took seriously. Proficient in the Shawnee language, Gertie addressed the assembled council directly. Referencing past expeditions undertaken at the behest of figures like Colonel Arbuckle against the colonists, he appealed to them, saying, "Shawnee, if you have ever had any intention of helping me, do it now and spare this man's life." Decisions among the Shawnee were typically made by council. After Gertie concluded his impassioned plea, the Shawnee war chief raised a war club and began to pass it around the circle of assembled chiefs and warriors. Those who agreed with Gertie's request to spare Kenton's life would pass the club to the next person in silence. Those who wished to see Kenton burned would strike the club on the ground 3 times. The council house resonated with the thudding sounds of votes for death, but these were outnumbered by the silent passes. Before the vote was fully tallied, Kenton understood that his life had been spared. The same individuals who had, only hours before, been deriving pleasure from his torture now approached him, some clapping him on the back and referring to him as a brother. In a significant gesture, a Shawnee woman, whose own son had died, formally adopted Kenton, a common practice that integrated him, at least nominally, into the tribe. For 2 weeks following this reprieve, it appeared Kenton's ordeal was finally over. A few days later, Gertie and Kenton, provided with fresh horses and clothing, departed Makachek. The 2 friends journeyed together, Kenton enjoying his newfound, if precarious, liberty. They traveled at a leisurely pace, taking notes on the territory they passed through, believing the entire affair had concluded. Unknown to them, Kenton's release had not been universally accepted among all Shawnee factions. Dissenting voices had argued against Gertie's intervention. Less than 3 weeks after his release, a war party of these dissatisfied Shawnee intercepted Gertie and Kenton. They demanded Kenton's return to the Shawnee villages for another council. The moment Kenton re-entered the council house, the atmosphere confirmed his renewed peril. The Shawnee who had called him brother just 3 weeks prior now openly jeered at him. This time, the council was convened specifically to vote on whether he should be executed. The war club circulated again. With each man, the club struck the earth. Gertie's renewed pleas for his friend's life were met with stony refusal. They fell on deaf ears. As a final desperate measure, Gertie made one last request: that Kenton's execution by fire be postponed. He proposed it be delayed until a larger gathering at Sandusky, where many more Shawnee would soon convene to meet with British trade representatives. The council agreed to this. The rationale, from their perspective, was that a public execution at such a significant gathering would provide a more potent spectacle for all Shawnee to witness. Gertie, for his part, likely hoped this delay would provide some unforeseen opportunity or allow him time to leverage other influences before the Sandusky meeting. With only this tenuous promise of a temporary stay, Gertie departed, leaving Kenton, once more, solely in the hands of the Shawnee. Kenton's second period of intense torture commenced, reportedly with even greater brutality than the first. The gauntlet runs, the constant beatings, the public humiliation, all these resumed. As the Shawnee party marched him towards Sandusky, new torments were devised. On one occasion, a Shawnee warrior, angered that Kenton had sat down without permission, struck his arm with a club, breaking it. Another, wielding a tomahawk, brought it down on Kenton's collarbone, shattering it. Yet again, when all hope seemed extinguished, an unexpected potential ally emerged. This was Chief Logan, a leader of the Mingo people. Logan was known for a degree of benevolence towards white settlers, and his lands lay along the route the Shawnee were taking to Sandusky. Logan learned of the prisoner being escorted by the Shawnee party and arranged to speak with Kenton one night. Kenton's pitiable physical state, a testament to the severe abuse he had endured, apparently moved Logan. He dispatched 2 messengers ahead of the Shawnee party to Sandusky, with instructions to plead for Kenton's life. If these emissaries were successful, they might persuade the Shawnee already gathered at Sandusky to spare him. Kenton could only cling to Logan's word as they continued the final leg of their journey. As they approached Sandusky, however, there was no visible sign that Logan's intervention had yielded any positive result. The place designated for his execution came into view. A stake had already been erected. Logan's messengers were nowhere to be seen. Unlike his arrivals at previous villages, the Shawnee at Sandusky did not force Kenton to run the gauntlet. This omission was not an act of mercy. Rather, Kenton was by now so physically weakened from his injuries and mistreatment that such an ordeal would no longer provide them with any sport. The following morning, Kenton was led towards the prepared pyre. It appeared his luck had finally, definitively, run out. As the crowd assembled and Kenton was made to walk his final steps, the sky darkened. Clouds gathered rapidly, and a sudden, violent thunderstorm broke over the area. The downpour was intense, soaking everything, including the wood stacked for the pyre. Within minutes, the pyre was now too wet to ignite. Kenton internally attributed this to divine intervention. The Shawnee, too, were unsettled, murmuring that it might be a sign from the Great Spirit. Such a dramatic last-minute intervention could hardly be ascribed to mere coincidence. However, the Shawnee had made a vow to burn him, and they intended to fulfill it. They announced the execution would proceed in a few days, once everything had dried. The day scheduled for Kenton's third impending execution dawned clear and sunny. Fate, it seemed, had one final intervention in store for Simon Kenton. The primary reason for the large Shawnee gathering at Sandusky was to meet with British representatives for trade and diplomacy. On that very morning, these British agents, led by a man named Pierre Drouillard, often recorded as Drouillard or Drouillard, arrived. They brought with them valuable trade goods, kegs of rum, tobacco, firearms, and other supplies coveted by their Shawnee allies. Drouillard made only one request of the Shawnee leadership in exchange for these goods: the life of Simon Kenton. It transpired that Chief Logan had not sent his messengers to plead with the Shawnee directly. Instead, he had astutely dispatched them to the British, knowing they possessed the leverage, in the form of trade goods, to negotiate for Kenton's life. The Shawnee Council considered the exchange. The life of this single troublesome horse thief in return for goods valued at approximately $100. They deemed it a fair bargain and accepted the terms. Simon Kenton's life was spared, yet he was not free. He was turned over to the British, who took him as their prisoner. He was transported to Detroit, a key British post, for interrogation. The British authorities likely hoped to extract useful intelligence regarding American frontier settlements and military dispositions. In Detroit, Kenton's treatment improved markedly. He was adequately fed, provided with new clothes, and allowed a degree of freedom to move about within the confines of the town. Nevertheless, he remained a prisoner of war. It was not until June of 1779, nearly 2 years after his initial capture, that Kenton finally regained his true freedom. With the assistance of a friend he had made within the city during his captivity, he managed to escape from Detroit. He acquired a horse and rode away, a free man once more. Kenton's survival through this protracted series of captures, tortures, and near executions was an extraordinary feat, attributable to a remarkable confluence of fortitude, opportune interventions, and sheer luck. The narrative of survival on the frontier takes many forms, some, like Simon Kenton's, marked by repeated captures and fortuitous interventions. The ordeal of John Coulter, however, showcases raw physical endurance and quick thinking in a singular, desperate flight, a survival perhaps even more improbable than Kenton's. Coulter was, in many ways, an archetypal American frontiersman. A veteran of the Lewis and Clark expedition, he possessed intimate knowledge of the Western territories. His livelihood was derived from the fur trade, trapping, and exploration across the vast American continent. By the year 1809, Coulter and his associate John Potts were counted among the most seasoned and experienced pioneers operating in the American West. Their focus at this time was on new trapping expeditions up the Missouri River. Both men were well acquainted with the geography of the region. They were also acutely aware that the dominant Native American group in their targeted area was the Blackfeet Nation. The Blackfeet held no amity for American trappers and explorers. Several years prior, the Lewis and Clark expedition had an encounter with the Blackfeet that escalated into a skirmish, resulting in the deaths of 2 Blackfeet warriors. This incident had fostered a lasting hostility. Consequently, when Coulter and Potts commenced their journey up the Missouri River into Blackfeet territory in May of 1809, they exercised considerable caution to avoid detection. They selected a stretch of river in what is now Montana, setting their beaver traps under the cover of darkness and concealing themselves during daylight hours to minimize the risk of encountering Blackfeet patrols. One early morning, as Coulter and Potts were paddling their canoe downstream to check their trap lines, they heard a distinct rumbling sound emanating from the riverbanks, a sound suggestive of hundreds of feet moving across the ground. Coulter, his senses honed by years on the frontier, immediately suspected the presence of Blackfeet and urged Potts that they should turn back. Potts, however, dismissed the sound, opining it was likely a herd of bison, and they continued downstream for a short while longer. Coulter's initial assessment soon proved correct. Blackfeet warriors materialized on the high banks lining both sides of the river. They were armed with bows drawn, clearly prepared to unleash a volley of arrows upon the 2 trappers. The Blackfeet warriors gestured emphatically for Coulter and Potts to bring their canoe to the shore, making it clear that failure to comply would result in their immediate deaths. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Coulter and Potts had no viable option but to obey. Coulter possessed a rudimentary understanding of the Blackfoot language and reasoned that attempting to negotiate might offer a better chance of survival than any attempt at flight or resistance. Potts, however, appeared to disagree with this assessment. As Coulter maneuvered the canoe towards the riverbank and stepped out, Potts made a sudden, defiant move. He pushed the canoe back into the current, raised his rifle, aimed at the nearest Blackfoot warrior, and fired. The shot was almost instantaneous with the response. Potts was struck by a hail of arrows and fell dead into the canoe. His action was not an attempt to escape. It was a decision for a swift death rather than capture. The Blackfeet were not known for their leniency towards trespassers or enemies. With Potts dead, they turned their full attention to Coulter. They stripped him of his weapons and clothing, then began to deliberate his fate. Coulter, with his knowledge of their language, could comprehend the various methods of torture and execution being proposed. Would they tie him to a stake and use him for archery practice? Would they subject him to scalping while still alive? A practice known among some tribes? After some discussion among the warriors, the chief approached Coulter. He eyed the captive, then posed a simple question: "Can you run fast?" Coulter, recognizing that his answer could determine the nature of his impending death, nodded in the affirmative. An experienced frontiersman like Coulter, to have survived as long as he had, would necessarily have maintained a high level of physical conditioning. The Blackfeet warriors then led Coulter away from the river, onto the open prairie. The terrain here was flat and stretched for miles, offering no immediate cover. The chief gestured towards the distant horizon, a slight smile playing on his lips. Then he gave the command, "Run!" Coulter began to run. He was completely naked, without even moccasins to protect his feet from the harsh prairie ground. He knew he had only a few moments' head start before the Blackfeet warriors, all young and fit, would begin their pursuit. They were turning his execution into a sport, a human hunt. However, the Blackfeet had underestimated John Coulter. His speed, and more critically his endurance, honed by years of traversing wilderness terrain, surpassed that of most of his pursuers. By the time the Blackfeet raised the signal cry and commenced the chase in earnest, Coulter had already established a lead of several hundred yards. He ran on, his bare feet cut and pierced by thorns and the sharp spines of prickly pear cactus that littered the ground. He pushed his body to its limits, running until he was so exhausted that blood began to trickle from his nose, a sign of extreme physical exertion. When he risked a glance back over his shoulder, he saw that he was indeed outdistancing most of the pursuing party. If he could maintain this pace, it was conceivable that the main body of Blackfeet would not catch him. However, one warrior was significantly faster than the others. This individual, carrying a spear, steadily closed the distance between himself and Coulter. Despite the encumbrance of his weapon, the warrior gained ground. 100 yards, then 50, then just 20 yards separated them. Coulter could anticipate the feel of the spearhead in his back at any moment. He was approximately 1 mile from the Jefferson River when he realized he could not outrun this particular warrior. The Blackfoot would reach him before he could gain the potential sanctuary of the water. In that critical moment, Coulter recalled the example of his companion Potts. A swift death, faced head-on, was preferable to a prolonged and agonizing one. With this thought, Coulter abruptly stopped and turned to face his pursuer. The sudden halt was unexpected. The Blackfoot warrior, surprised by Coulter's action and unable to check his own momentum quickly enough, stumbled as he attempted to hurl his spear. He fell to the ground, the spear shaft breaking and the point skittering away from his grasp. Coulter reacted instantly. He seized the pointed end of the broken spear shaft and lunged, thrusting it into the chest of the fallen warrior. Coulter did not pause to ascertain if the warrior was dead. He immediately spun around and resumed his run towards the river. He ran until he could no longer hear or see any of the other Blackfeet behind him. Finally, he reached the Jefferson River and threw himself into the cold water. Near the bank, a large beaver lodge, a jumble of logs and sticks, offered a potential hiding place. Coulter dove underwater and swam towards the lodge, desperate to find an air pocket within the tangled structure just as he heard the sounds of the remaining Blackfeet warriors arriving at the riverbank. The warriors began to search the area, scanning the river and its banks for any sign of their escaped captive. Some of them climbed onto the very beaver lodge under which Coulter was concealed, probing the structure with their weapons. Coulter remained submerged, breathing from a small air pocket he had found, listening to the movements and voices above him. After several hours, the Blackfeet, having found no trace of him, apparently concluded he had drowned or somehow slipped away downstream. The sounds of their voices and movements gradually faded as they abandoned the search. Coulter was alone once more. He waited until the deep cover of night before cautiously emerging from his hiding place in the beaver lodge. He slipped silently into the river and began to swim downstream, using the current to carry him away from the area of his pursuit. He continued in this manner for several hours before he felt it was safe enough to come ashore. He scanned his surroundings. The Blackfeet were nowhere in sight. Through a combination of extraordinary speed, calculated risk, and sheer fortune, John Coulter had escaped what had seemed certain death. His ordeal, however, was far from over. Coulter was still completely naked, bleeding from the wounds on his feet and the exertion of his run, and alone in the wilderness without food, water, or any supplies. Fortunately, his years of experience on the frontier provided him with survival skills that few possessed. He knew which plants were safe to eat, how to find potable water, and, critically, he knew that by following the course of the Missouri River system, he could eventually make his way back to a frontier settlement or trading post. 11 days after his capture by the Blackfeet and the death of John Potts, a gaunt, dehydrated, and severely lacerated John Coulter stumbled into Fort Raymond, an American fur trading post at the confluence of the Bighorn and Yellowstone rivers. He was alive, a fact that bordered on the miraculous. News of Coulter's incredible escape spread rapidly among the other frontiersmen and traders. Coulter himself recounted his adventure to several individuals. Among them was George Drouillard, a fellow veteran of the Lewis and Clark expedition and a friend. Notably, George Drouillard was the son of Pierre Drouillard, the same man who had played a crucial role in ransoming Simon Kenton from the Shawnee years earlier. The account Coulter gave to Drouillard was recorded by Drouillard's companion, a Dr. William Thomas, who subsequently published the story. Through this publication, the tale of Coulter's run became a legendary story of the American frontier, a dramatic display of human endurance. John Coulter fell ill and died 3 years later, in 1812 or 1813. But the story of his harrowing encounter with the Blackfeet and his astonishing escape lived on long after his death, cemented as a classic tale of survival against overwhelming odds, achieved through years of physical conditioning and deep knowledge of the wilderness. The narratives of Simon Kenton and John Coulter showcase survival through wilderness, expertise, opportune aid, or extraordinary physical prowess. But what of individuals lacking such experience when thrust into captivity among Native American groups? The historical record indicates that escape was achievable, though often at a brutal cost, involving bloodshed for both the captives and their captors. The account of Hannah Dustin of Haverhill, Massachusetts, illustrates such an episode. Hannah Dustin was a woman of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In February of 1697, at the age of 40, she and her husband Thomas welcomed their 9th child, a daughter named Martha. Their family life, supported by a nurse, Mary Neff, who was regarded almost as kin, was by colonial standards peaceful. This period, however, was marked by King William's War, a conflict pitting the English colonies against New France and its Native American allies. The Massachusetts government had even instituted a bounty, offering £50 for each Native American scalp. Such geopolitical struggles likely seemed distant concerns to the Dustin household. Their domestic tranquility was shattered on the 15th of March, 1697. A war party of approximately 30 Abenaki warriors, allied with the French, descended upon the outskirts of Haverhill. The Abenaki considered settlements like Haverhill legitimate targets for raids. By the time the alarm was raised within the village, Abenaki warriors were already in the streets. They commenced looting dwellings and killing any colonist who offered resistance, while others fled in terror. For Hannah Dustin and Mary Neff, the immediate priority was the safety of the Dustin children. They hurried the older children out the back of their dwelling, directing them towards the fields where their father, Thomas Dustin, was working. Thomas, like most men in the colonial militia, was armed. Upon hearing the alarm, he ran towards his home and family. By the time he reached his property, Abenaki warriors were already there. Thomas opened fire with his musket, providing covering fire for his children as the Abenaki returned shots. Quickly counting his children, he realized only 8 were with him. Hannah, Mary Neff, and the infant Martha were still inside the house. Hannah and Mary had been delayed by the difficulty of moving quickly while carrying the newborn. The other children had managed to escape. Before Hannah and Mary could exit the house with Martha, Abenaki warriors surrounded them. Thomas Dustin faced an agonizing choice: attempt a rescue of the 3, or remain with and protect the 8 children already under his care. He made the difficult decision to stay with the larger group of his children, covering their retreat from Haverhill. The Abenaki did not pursue them far. Their primary objective was plunder, not prolonged engagement or the pursuit of every fleeing colonist. A few additional settler lives were of little consequence to their immediate aims. Hannah, still holding baby Martha, was grouped with Mary Neff and about a dozen other captives taken from the village, many of them children. The Abenaki spent a short time looting what they could carry before setting fire to the town. They then marched their prisoners into the wilderness. To witness her home and village burning while being led into captivity was a traumatic experience, but Hannah Dustin's suffering was only beginning. The infant Martha, distressed by the chaos, the fire, the shouting, and the palpable fear she likely sensed from her mother, cried incessantly. A 6-week-old baby could not comprehend the situation. To the Abenaki warriors, the crying infant was an irritant and a liability. A newborn offered them no practical value as a captive. Without warning, one Abenaki warrior seized Martha from Hannah's arms, swung the infant, and smashed her head against a tree. Hannah's world fractured. The brutality of this act was so shocking that several other captive children began to scream. The Abenaki warriors responded by killing them as well. Hannah and Mary Neff were not even permitted to bury the infant. Instead, they were forced to march throughout the night. Their captors did not subject them to further physical torture at this point, perhaps believing the psychological trauma of witnessing the infant's murder was sufficient to break their spirits. After several days of travel, the war party and its captives were deep enough in the wilderness that any hope of escape and return to colonial society seemed futile. Hannah and Mary were eventually assigned as slaves to a specific Abenaki family group. This group consisted of 12 individuals. They already held one white captive, a 14-year-old English boy named Samuel Leonardson, who had been captured 2 years prior. After several weeks of travel, this Abenaki family group, with their captives, reached a settlement on an island in the Merrimack River, near present-day Boscawen, New Hampshire, which was then known as Pennacook. Here, their new masters informed Hannah and Mary that they would be subjected to the customary treatment for new prisoners, being stripped naked and forced to run a gauntlet while being beaten. Pennacook was approximately 150 miles from the nearest English settlement. Any escape attempt through such a distance of unfamiliar wilderness would, under normal circumstances, be considered a death sentence, or so their Abenaki captors likely assumed. They allowed their new captives a certain degree of freedom in carrying out daily chores, apparently not considering the grieving mother, the nurse, or the long-term captive boy to pose any significant threat. Despite, or perhaps because of, the brutal murder of her daughter, Hannah Dustin's will to survive had not been extinguished. These Abenaki individuals had killed her child before her eyes and intended to subject her to a life of servitude. She resolved not to endure this injustice passively. She would seek retribution, blood for blood. In the dead of night on the 29th of April, 1697, Hannah quietly awakened Mary Neff and Samuel Leonardson. All 12 members of the Abenaki family lay sleeping in their wigwam. Hannah armed herself, Mary, and Samuel with tomahawks she had managed to purloin from their captors. She outlined her plan. They would escape, but not before they had exacted revenge. The three crept into the wigwam. Hannah targeted one of the sleeping Abenaki men, Samuel Leonardson the other. They raised the tomahawks over their sleeping captors and brought them down with force. Both men were killed instantly. 2 of the Abenaki women were killed before they could fully rouse themselves. A third Abenaki woman sustained a blow to the head but managed to escape the wigwam screaming into the night. An Abenaki boy also managed to escape the carnage. Then Hannah turned her attention to the remaining children of the Abenaki family. The Abenaki had taken her child. She would do likewise. Hannah Dustin, Mary Neff, and Samuel Leonardson killed 6 Abenaki children. In total, 10 members of the Abenaki family were killed, 2 men, 2 women, and 6 children. The 3 English captives then scalped all 10 of their victims. The bounty of 50 pounds per scalp offered by the Massachusetts government was a powerful incentive, provided they could survive to collect it. Before the 2 Abenaki who had escaped could alert other Abenaki groups nearby, Hannah, Mary, and Samuel took the Abenaki family's canoe, loaded their gruesome trophies, and pushed off into the river. Under the cover of darkness, and with the river current aiding their passage, they made their escape before any organized pursuit could be mounted. Several days later, their canoe reached Haverhill. Thomas Dustin and the surviving members of Hannah's family were there to meet them. By the time Hannah returned, the Massachusetts General Assembly had rescinded the general scalp bounty. However, in recognition of their ordeal and actions, the authorities awarded a special payment of 50 pounds to be divided among the 3 escapees, 25 pounds for Hannah Dustin, and 12 pounds and 10 shillings each for Mary Neff and Samuel Leonardson. Hannah Dustin lived to be over 80 years old. Mary Neff died in 1722, and Samuel Leonardson in 1718. Their story gained notoriety in New England for a time. However, none of the three survivors ever wrote down their own account of the events. It was not until the 19th century, during later periods of intense conflict between the United States and Native American nations, that Hannah Dustin's story was rediscovered and popularized. She was elevated to the status of a folk hero, her actions commemorated in statues and paintings. However, the legacy of a woman who admittedly killed and scalped women and children in an act of retaliatory violence has also been a subject of considerable controversy and reevaluation in more recent times. The harrowing experiences of Kenton, Coulter, and Dustin illuminate the brutal realities of frontier warfare and captivity, and the extreme measures individuals undertook to reclaim their freedom. Whether through fortune, physical speed, or brutal vengeance, these individuals purchased their liberty under the direst of circumstances. These chronicles from a turbulent past show the lengths people went for survival. The choices made in such desperate times often blur lines we hold clear today. Which of these three incredible stories of escape impacted you the most? Let us know in the comments below.